So in the last episode, which I recommend that you watch before getting into this one, we ended with the final years of King Shalmaneser III of Assyria, as well as the beginnings of the Yehu Dynasty of the Kingdom of Israel. Basically, Yehu made peace with Assyria and Shalmaneser, becoming one of his vassals and sending tribute annually. This was most likely done not out of any love for Assyria, but out of pragmatism, due to the fact that militarily, Israel was no match for Assyria. Eventually though, they would challenge Assyria, which we'll take a look at in this episode. When King Yehu of Israel made peace with Shalmaneser III in 841 BC, Assyria was without a doubt the most powerful state in the region. It ruled an empire that stretched from what are today the Zagros Mountains in Iran to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea in the west. Yehu knew that to not be on good terms with Assyria would bring disaster to both his people and his newly founded dynasty. At the same time, he had more pressing, local concerns with his often hostile neighbor, the kingdom of Aram Damascus. In general, if you were a vassal of Assyria, you had several responsibilities to the Assyrian crown, mainly to provide hefty tribute as well as soldiers for the Assyrian king's military campaigns. In return, though, the Assyrian king would have your back, as an attack on an Assyrian vassal was considered to be an attack on Assyria itself. And honestly, no one really wanted to face the might of the Assyrian army in a pitched battle. So in theory, Yehu and the Kingdom of Israel had Assyrian protection from their enemies. The problem, though, was that Assyria itself was going through some changes politically that weakened the power of the king. Here's what happened. A few years before Shalmaneser III's death, a civil war broke out between two of his sons, Ashur-dayin-aplu and Shamshi-Ramman. Ashur-dayin-aplu was the older son, but for whatever reason, Shalmaneser favored Shamshi-Ramman and appointed him as the crown prince. Ashur-dayin-aplu, who had also amassed many loyal supporters, challenged his father's decision and rose up in rebellion. Though he was ultimately defeated, the central authority of the government, as well as the very institution of absolute monarchy, rested on shaky ground. When Shalmaneser III passed on in 824 BC, Shamshi-Ramman became the king of Assyria and adopted the throne name Shamshiyadad the Fifth. Though victorious, Shamshiyadad the Fifth still had many enemies, especially loyalists of his brother, who may have still held key positions within the government. However, to keep the empire together, he could not simply dismiss all of them. Shalmaneser III had grown the Assyrian Empire to such an extent, both in terms of territory and bureaucracy, that it was getting too difficult for simply one king to manage. As new territories were absorbed into the empire, powerful governors and field marshals began to obtain more power than was commensurate with their rank or status, especially those on the empire's periphery. We'll call these individuals magnates. In time, these magnates set up small fiefdoms of their own and became states within a state. They collected their own taxes, had their own private militias, and in some cases, even conducted their own foreign policy. With regard to the central government, all they really had to do was pay lip service to the emperor in Assyria. In addition, they also didn't have a vested interest in preserving the king's alliances. After all, small kingdoms like Israel had pledged their allegiance to the Assyrian king, not to them. So for example, if Aram Damascus attacked Israel, the magnates could turn a blind eye to the conflict and not come to the aid of Assyria's vassals if it wasn't in their own personal interest. While Shalmaneser III was alive, Aram Damascus's king, Hazael, was kept in check. However, after Shalmaneser's death and the civil war between his sons, Hazael was able to launch attacks on Israel, seize much of its outlying territories, and eventually come to dominate it. Not only Israel, but also Judah, Gilead, Moab, as well as areas deep in Philistine territory. Things got a bit better for Yehu's son and successor, Jehoaz. In 811 BC, the Assyrian king Adad-nirari III went to war with Aram Damascus and more or less crushed the kingdom, According to Assyrian records, Israel, along with Tyre, Sidon, Edom, and the Philistine states, paid tribute to Adad-nirari. Though harsh, they at least didn't have to suffer the same fate as Aram Damascus. It also gave these kingdoms, including Israel, time to rebuild and eventually prosper once again. In 745 BC, one of the most powerful and influential kings of the ancient world was crowned in Assyria, Tiglath-pileser III. He reorganized and modernized the Assyrian army, as well as took a more ruthless, take-no-prisoners approach towards his enemies, both foreign and domestic. Governors and field marshals were replaced with Tiglath-pileser's loyalists, and once again, Assyria's frontiers expanded in all directions. The kingdoms of the Levant were given the following options: surrender, become a vassal of the Assyrian king, and pay a hefty tribute, or risk being destroyed and having any survivors deported to foreign lands. Israel and Judah both decided on option 1, rather than suffer the wrath of Tiglath-pileser. There are a few inscriptions of Tiglath-pileser that list some of the Levantine kings who paid tribute to him. One of these includes Israel's King Menahem and reads, "The tribute of Cush-Tashbi of Kumu, Rezin of Damascus, Menahem of Samaria, Hiram of Tyre, Sebitibiel of Byblos, Uriki of Kue, Pisiris of Carchemish, Eniil of Hamath, Panamu of Samaal, I received." Another inscription indicates that Menahem did not submit willingly, and ultimately, it was Tiglath-pileser who made the final decision as to who would sit on Israel's throne. "As for Menahem, I overwhelmed him, and he fled like a bird, alone and bowed to my feet. I returned him to his place and imposed tribute upon him. Gold, silver, linen garments with multicolored trimmings I received from him. Israel, its inhabitants and their possessions, I led to Assyria. They overthrew their king, Pekah, and I placed Hosea as king over them. I received from them 10 talents of gold, 1,000 talents of silver as their tribute, and brought them to Assyria." When Tiglath-pileser III died in 727 BC, his son, Shalmaneser V, became the new king of Assyria. Assyrian, biblical, and the works of the historian Josephus all state that many of the states of the Levant, including Israel and the Phoenician city-states, took their chances with Shalmaneser and at least initially began to withhold their tribute, probably at the instigation of the Egyptians, who were growing wary of the Assyrian influence on their doorstep. This obviously was unacceptable to Shalmaneser, and so the Assyrian army came in full force to gently remind its vassals of their obligations to the crown. Many of these states and their kings resubmitted to Assyria. Scholars still debate exactly what transpired between Israel and Assyria during this time, but it seems that there was plenty of armed conflict and violence. The Hebrew Bible reports that the Assyrians laid siege to Israel's capital of Samaria for 3 years and took Hosea prisoner. On the Assyrian side, we don't have any inscriptions from Shalmaneser V. Our only other real reference to a specific attack on Israel and Samaria comes from a Babylonian chronicle, which states, "On the 25th day of the month Tebet, Shalmaneser ascended the throne in Assyria and Akkad. He ravaged Samaria. The 5th year, Shalmaneser died in the month Tebet. For 5 years, Shalmaneser ruled Akkad and Assyria. On the 12th day of the month Tebet, Sargon ascended the throne in Assyria." This particular Sargon was Sargon II of Assyria, who many, if not most scholars, believe may have been a usurper. Regardless, he would go on to become one of the most powerful kings in the history of Assyria. With regard to Israel, Sargon claims that it was not Shalmaneser V, but he who not only conquered, but also depopulated the city. Sargon tells us, in much more detail than his brother, his version of events as follows. "In the beginning of my reign, when I took my seat on the royal throne and was crowned with a lordly crown, The Sumerians, who agreed with another hostile king not to continue their slavery and not to deliver tribute, and who started hostility, I fought with them and completed their defeat. 27,280 people who lived therein, with their chariots, I carried off as spoil. 50 chariots for my royal bodyguard I mustered from among them, and the rest of them I settled in the midst of Assyria. The city of Samaria I resettled and made it greater than before. People of the lands conquered by my own hand I brought there. When both of these texts are taken together, and along with other historical evidence, it seems that Sargon may have simply completed what Shalmaneser the Fifth started. That is, Shalmaneser the Fifth conquered Samaria, but Sargon made this defeat a permanent one by deporting its population and creating a new Assyrian province, Samarina. This effectively brought an end to the kingdom of Israel. As for its people, Sargon II says that he deported them to other parts of the empire, which was standard Assyrian practice for rebellious and reconquered peoples. What their ultimate fate was, though, is unknown, and there are all sorts of explanations. The biblical tradition refers to them as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and claims that they were resettled on the other end of the Assyrian Empire, in or around Media. The historian Josephus also seems to support the assertion that they were taken somewhere to the east of the Euphrates River. Regardless of where exactly they ended up, historians believe that, similar to other deported peoples, over time, they were assimilated into their new environment, wherever that may have been. Israel's cousin to the south, the kingdom of Judah, since it hadn't openly rebelled against Assyria, was spared destruction. This, though, doesn't mean that it was in the clear. In fact, with Aram Damascus and the kingdom of Israel no longer providing a buffer between it and Assyria, its situation was more precarious than ever. In a future video, we'll take a look at Sargon's son, Sennacherib, and his invasion of the Levant, as well as the assault on Judah's capital, Jerusalem. Stay tuned. As always, thanks so much for stopping by, I really appreciate it. If you learned something, or simply just enjoyed the video, please don't hesitate to hit that like button, because it helps the channel out a lot. Also check out the History with Sai podcast, where I go into more detail with regard to some of the topics discussed on the channel. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Take care, and stay safe.